Hello, welcome to Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Arts, and I'm delighted to be joined by my guest, Dr. Bill Piltz from Elgin Community College. We want to talk about his most recent book, A People's History of Modern Europe, which takes us from the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 up through the fall of the Soviet Union. The International Institute of Social History called it an intellectual tour de force. I don't think you can have anything higher than that. So we're going to have two 15-minute segments here about Dr. Piltz to cover 600 years of history. And as a historian, I know that's not possible for you to do. But could you just kind of express to our viewers what's the primary approach that you took to talking about a people's history of modern Europe as opposed to what you might find in a typical high school history class?
Well, I think I sort of took a famous poem by German communist Bertolt Brecht as an example. It's called A Worker Reads History. And he talks about who built the seven gates, and when Alexander conquered the world, was not even a cook in his army, and so on. Because so often we look at history completely from the top down. It's always the generals, the pharaohs, the emperors, the money men, the good, great and the good. They're the ones that make history. Yeah. But in fact, history is always molded by common people. I mean, just the example of Alexander the Great. I was shocked when I found out in college that he ended his conquest because his soldiers wouldn't go on. Because I was just taught in high school that, okay, he conquered all this stuff and so on. But the bottom line was he could only be that conqueror as long as people followed him. And that's true for any system. It only can last as long as the people put up with it.
So Alexander didn't fight, the generals don't fight, it's the soldiers on the ground that do the fighting.
Exactly, exactly. And it's the same thing in terms of obedience to authority in general.
Yeah.
If people no longer conform, what can you do?
This is almost like a companion volume to Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. It's got a larger, a broader scope, but one of the things that strikes me is some of the things that we understand to be the result of these exceptional individuals, Joan of Arc or Robespierre or Mussolini. There's always these individuals that rise up, and somehow world history is made by these individuals. But what your book is arguing is that there's social forces at play that allow, or that these individuals step into. How does that? I mean, would there have been a French Revolution without Robespierre?
Absolutely.
Would there have been another Robespierre?
Yes, there would have been other people who have the speaking roles in history. But I mean, I think most history gets it exactly mirror image wrong. That is to say, they say an individual comes in and creates the situation, creates the times. But the individual can only create the situation, create the times, if the mass of the population is already moving in that direction and receptive to their message. If they're not receptive to the message, it'll go nowhere.
So why would a mass of people, say the peasants, where you start, the peasants of 1381, why do peasants who are all over the countryside, got their own little plots of land, why would the peasants as a mass or as a collective rise up? What would prompt that?
Because they were tired of the oppression they were feeling from the feudal lords, and more their belief in the church had declined, which used to threaten them with hell if they didn't obey. You had a weak king at the time that they didn't fear. So various things sort of conspired to give the peasants confidence. And once they'd started gathering and having protests, and the fact that they weren't dispersed, they couldn't disperse them, they saw how weak the feudal lords actually were, how afraid the feudal lords were of their power.
The emperor has no clothes.
Yes, the emperor has no clothes, exactly.
In the writing of the book, or in one of the instances, let's take the French Revolution, because people generally know there was one in 1789, and they lopped off their heads and all of these very dramatic events. Let's take the French Revolution. You're saying people no longer accept or will tolerate the conditions they find themselves in. They begin a revolt, they get confidence from that. Is there a template, or is there a list of categories that a historian can go down that say, we're reaching the point where large numbers of people are going to resist. We're reaching the point where whatever powers that be are no longer, is there what, a model or a template or a list of
In
categories.
in a lot of ways, it comes from the French Revolution specifically. In other words, you have an old regime that no longer seems to be competent. People lose their respect for the old regime. The legitimation of the old regime, like Louis XVI in France, for example.
They become
Mockery. They're mocked first before they're overthrown.
because they are the individuals are incompetent.
The individuals are incompetent and the system, but the individual's incompetence reflects the system's inability to any longer deal with actual real problems.
Okay, so the feudal system could not deal with which problems, for example?
For example, they didn't have deficit spending, they didn't have a modern finance system, and you basically had a system that was based on precious metals, and they overspent on the American Revolution, quite frankly. So the American Revolution helped bankrupt the king, and they had no idea how they could change that. And their social structure was such. The feudal lords didn't pay taxes. In other words, the people who had the most money, the feudal lords and the Roman Catholic Church, were exempt from taxation. So obviously that meant any attempt to raise revenue, means you have to squeeze people who are already desperately poor.
Sounds like contemporary times. Maybe we'll come back to that.
Okay.
One thing you just mentioned, this is a history of modern Europe, but you brought in the United States,
Right.
which is to imply even in 1789 that no country, historical developments in any individual country doesn't happen within the bounds of that country's borders.
Oh,
the
absolutely.
French Revolution is one of the categories. The inability of in this case, the monarchy to rule was in part due to events external to that monarchy?
Yes, and also what the French call contagion. The fact is, if you're a French soldier and you come over to the British North American colonies, and you find these people who, to some extent, you find culturally inferior, and you find them bigoted, they're hostile to Roman Catholics, but they managed to overthrow the British government. Right, kick them out of their territory.
They got rid of their king.
Right, and
why can't we get rid of our king?
Because remember, the soldiers who served in North America, they go back to France, and they're not all in one little military camp or something. People finish their tour of duty, they get leave, they go throughout France, and they tell people what they saw in British North America.
To make a connection again with U.S. history, which probably we're more familiar with, black soldiers that fought in World War II and came home and experienced the democracy and the civil rights treatment that they had as human beings in France and elsewhere come back no longer would tolerate the conditions of Jim Crow because of contagion. Is that
right?
The experience of a different cultural phenomena that puts you understand your place in the world differently because you've experienced a different spot.
And to use the French Revolution in a different context, it was the French Revolution that helps inspire the Haitian Revolution. Because when they saw that France was revolting, it gave more encouragement to the slaves, the black slaves, to rise up and form the first African republic in the Western Hemisphere.
Just putting these things together, we're talking about the French Revolution. That is, in part compelled because of the American Revolution that had an effect on the French crown. Then the French Revolution leaves to the Haitian Revolution. It's like these things are intertwined.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, Eric Hobsbawm, famous British historian who died a few years ago, he wrote a book called Echoes of the Marseillaise, and he makes the argument that actually the French Revolution had a great influence way beyond what we'd think, including, for example, Vietnam. He said the leaders of the Vietnamese Revolution were all students of the French Revolution. They'd all read about the French Revolution, that Ho Chi Minh and other people who defeated the French and the Americans later in Vietnam had studied the French Revolution. They sort of took it as a role model.
So I feel like I'm a student of history preparing for the final exam. I want to get this.
It's going to be essay.
Yes, okay. But I'm looking for something more shorthand for television culture. The inability of the existing political and economic leadership to meet even its basic needs for its own social system.
Right.
So what you're saying is the feudal lords could not even meet the basic needs of financing the feudal system, let alone the larger population.
And ruling. If you ever saw the movie Dangerous Liaisons, for people who watch old movies talking about television culture, the feudal class was no longer a warrior class as it had once been. In France, it had been sort of degenerated into just a group of people partying, right? Spending all their money on partying and not partying on their estates, partying off in Versailles and so on.
Again, that
so
sounds like a trip to
far away.
What is it, Mar-a-Lago in Florida?
Yeah, well, you could say that. Or what stays in Vegas, or what stays in Versailles, stays in Versailles.
We're going to take a break in a minute, but I want to see if I can. I know a historian doesn't like to do this because you don't like things to be just little lists, but I'm trying
to get a list here.
I'm trying to get a list here. One is the inability of the existing power structure to meet its own needs, the rising incompetence of that power structure because there is no, impetus, there's no creativity within that structure. The third thing I recognize from what you said is the refusal or the inability even of the larger population, whether it was peasants or early working class in France, to survive. So the austerity or the, as you said, the wringing out reached a point where resistance seemed to be the only option. So we've got this series, but that still doesn't make for a revolution.
They also have to have the belief that a different world is possible.
And that comes in part from their resistance?
Partly from the American Revolution. If the Americans can do it, we can do it.
There's another example.
And the Enlightenment, right? You had various philosophers like Voltaire, who were going on and on about how we could have a better world.
Okay.
And that filters down to the common people.
The final thing would be, we've got these conditions. The power is no longer powerful in economic or political sense. They're no longer competent. The conditions of life for the majority of the population is no longer acceptable or tolerable. There is nothing left except to resist. There are examples of resistance. The final question for me was, in what way do they resist? Because it seems like on the one hand you could stone all the feudal lords and become pagan, or decide that Catholicism was the problem and you all become evangelical Baptists, or so my question is, what leads it in a trajectory that history tends to call progress?
Basically, that when they looked for a better world, they didn't look for a different type of Christianity or different this or that, so much as they looked for a humanist thing coming out of the whole Enlightenment experience.
Okay.
And in terms of resistance, it starts with mocking the king, National Guard troops turning their backs to the king, and it becomes, very interestingly, it reaches deep into the roots of the Catholic Church. Many parish priests, if you will, defect to the revolution.
Okay, hold that, because we're going to come back to that and finish. Maybe we'll use a more contemporary example, but we're going to take a quick break. This is Calumet Roundtable. We'll be right back. Thank you. Hello, welcome back to Calumet Roundtable, the student-produced interviewing show at Purdue Northwest. We interview guests on contemporary issues and scholarly research. And today I'm delighted to have Dr. William Pelz from Elgin Community College talking about a people's history of modern Europe. We're going to talk about the entire 600-year history of Europe in about 30 minutes. The first half of the show, we only talked about the French Revolution and the rest. But maybe if we move forward to something that links with more of the contemporary conversation or concerns. There's a section of the population that believes with the election of Trump, we're moving in a very dangerous direction, and you hear the word fascism thrown out all the time, and then there's the allusions to Nazi Germany and the fact that Trump has Mein Kampf on his bedside, right under his TV and Twitter stand, I'm sure. But I just thought it would be helpful to talk about very briefly, I know this is unfair to a historian, but the rise of Nazi Germany, with your thesis, would say it wasn't that Hitler just showed up one day and announced, now we're going to have fascism. But there were some elements that happened which may or may not be today, which is what I think historians would want us to look at.
Right, the social conditions of Weimar Germany were incredibly severe. But even so, the Nazis and the far right didn't go anywhere until the Great Depression hit, which wiped out whatever modest gains in terms of stability they'd gotten. So they only had a few good years. But also the left had already failed in 1923 in terms of like revolting. So what you had is you had a situation, as Leon Trotsky once said, that the people who really ran things, the army elite and the grand bourgeoisie, the ruling class, they didn't want fascism. They liked fascism, as Trotsky said, as much as a man with aching teeth wants to go to the dentist. But they were really afraid. They were really afraid the German Communist Party was getting stronger and stronger. People were getting more and more disaffected. So they basically decided to throw their support behind Hitler.
So,
and he built a counter movement.
So some of these things we talked about in the first segment were there. The inability of the German capitalist class at this point to
Right.
continue to rule economically and politically, and and also the increased incompetence of the Weimar Republic, the refusal of the general population to accept their conditions. But the difference here is this follows a defeat of resistance. Is
It
that
follows a defeat of resistance.
so? There was a
in
resistance, but the
23.
resistance was not successful.
Right. There was
Okay.
a tremendous defeat of resistance on the one hand. On the other hand, it wasn't that Hitler just came along. They built up a structure over a number of years. It was very expensive. So what are you going to do with sort of militaristically inclined ex-veterans who are homeless? Give them a brown shirt uniform and give them a place to stay in an SA, brown shirt stormtrooper barracks, give them all the brats and beer they can drink, and you've got your own private army. And that costs a lot of money. And that's why he could only do this by building this infrastructure.
How is that different than claims that you might hear on Facebook or in conversation in some circles, that's what the police fulfill in the United States? The police are fascist, which is, it seems to me that's different than what you're describing.
Absolutely.
And how is it different? Because they had German police, but
Absolutely.
the German police were not part of the fascist movement?
Well, some of them might have been part of the fascist movement,
outside their-
but outside work. The thing is, the police are always conflicted because they have to face, citizen complaints and pushback when they're overzealous, when they're too brutal, and so on. They have some sort of at least superficial accountability. The thing about these private armies is they can do whatever are ordered and basically get away with it. Right? I mean, they can go around killing people, beating them up, and so on.
Ordered from, by
the power structure within their party, which takes orders in an indirect sense from the grand bourgeoisie.
okay, but that isn't the government per se.
No,
the
not at all.
government came after. The fascist movement was first. The financing and organization of that movement was first, and then government power came after that?
Yes, absolutely.
So
they
the
were
government-
already established power on the ground.
Okay.
They've taken over areas, whole areas, by force, unconstitutionally. And then the final coup d'etat only takes place, interestingly enough, after Hitler has peaked. In the last free elections in Germany, he's lost a scad of seats in the German Congress and 1 million votes. And his party is bankrupt. And some people are saying, well, he's losing. Maybe we shouldn't give him any more money.
So Hitler comes to power after his movement declines.
After his movement declines,
It's kind
and
of
he's
like
never
a-
got more than 40, he never got more than maybe 38% of the vote in a free election.
Which is about like our vote last time. But
Yeah.
this was after the defeat.
After,
What if this is like a pushback? We've lost. There's nothing. We've got nothing to lose. Let's just try to
well, the
physically
idea is we
take.
can't, the illusion that they could actually come to power democratically in some way
Had
or another.
disappeared.
That totally disappeared,
Okay.
right? They lost 1 million votes. Communists gained like, I don't know how many votes, hundreds of thousands of votes. I mean, so it was like sort of now or never.
So again, I'm going back to my list that I passed the first half of the exam. I'm going back to my list. We have this arrangement where the capitalist class, the arms of Krupp and the rest, was unable to continue to make their profits just through workers coming and selling goods. They couldn't do it. There was the Depression. The bottom fell out of the economy. They had no political answer with the Weimar Republic and no other thing. Hitler shows up, but he doesn't seem to be an answer either because his support electorally has declined. And the general population is unhappy with this, but they don't seem to be able to form any kind of social movement, any kind of collective response to stem the rise of fascism? Is that the missing component?
Yes, the resistance to Hitler is split. You have the liberals, who are, of course, sort of standing in line to sell out and always talking about the problem with Hitler was that he's too crude. But then, most importantly, the workers' movement is divided between the Social Democrats, who are the moderate socialists who want to work within the constitutional system, and the communists who are prepared to overthrow the system.
But
And
they were a minority.
well, they got 12% of the vote, so
Big minority.
they're a big minority.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't like a handful of people. So the resistance to Hitler was split, and there was the belief that, well, Hitler would have to follow the rules. Well, after he'd made a deal with the army and big business, there was no one to enforce the rules anymore, because the army, just violated their oath to the Weimar Republic and made a deal with Hitler in return for which he purged his stormtroopers for them. And they thought they could control him.
Are there instances in the 600-year history of where, because I wonder, even today, what's to stop the police in any city from doing what they want? I mean, the police roll into a community, says you're under arrest, I'm taking you away. You said, no, you're violating my civil rights, it's against the Constitution. They say, so what? We're the meanest gang on the block. We happen to have badges and guns, and you don't stop that. I mean,
I live in Chicago, so I'm used to that.
yeah, but I'm saying, is there an instance in history, in the long span that you looked, where the general population said, we are that force that will stop that violation of our civil rights? Or is it always as the Social Democrats and the Communist Party and the liberals just figure,
No.
well, what can we do because we have to be civil and they're not being civil, and isn't that bad, and we just have to go along? I mean, are there instances?
In Germany in 1918, I'll just use Berlin, most important city, as an example. They surrounded what they called the Alex, the central police station, hundreds and thousands of workers with arms and soldiers. And they demanded that the police all resign and come out of the building without their weapons. And some of those policemen probably would have been lynched if it hadn't been for more moderates calming the crowd down. So they formed a new Berlin police chief under
This
a guy.
must have been a huge demonstration, because you
Yes.
don't just surround the police station with a dozen people.
Oh yeah, no. We're talking about tens of thousands of
Okay.
people or whatever. And the police, the Kaiser's gone, there were, state of confusion and so on. And the guy who becomes police chief, who's later elected to the German Congress as a member of the Communist Party, he's a left socialist at the time. And what they do is they ask the various unions and disbanded army groups and so on to elect policemen, real community control over the police.
Now, there's a thought for today. If you want community control, it shouldn't be who's appointed by some police
Right.
chief that just was
You
brought
choose
in.
your own
You choose
policeman.
your own police.
The only exception was detectives. They hired back, after giving them sort of political screenings, they hired back professional
That's the
forensic experts and so on.
That's the first police reform I think makes sense, where the people elect their
They'd
own
elect-
police. That's what a concept. What's next? Are you working on another project along the people's history?
I'm-
Are we going to talk about people's history of modern Europe as opposed to?
We in the future, we might well do that. I'm working on a people's history of the German Revolution. That's why I was familiar with
Okay.
that example, because I've been working on that, because next year is the 100th anniversary of the German Revolution of 1918. So I'm working on that. I'm also series editor for Pluto Press of a new series we're trying to launch of people's history books.
Oh, excellent.
So we're
excellent.
actually going to have a people's history of sort of like the road to the Civil War, the road to Harper's Ferry that
Yes.
Professor Mark Laus from University of Cincinnati is going to do.
People's history of all the people that resisted,
Exactly.
that got us to the Civil War, or a
Right.
people's history since. When I was thinking about Malcolm X when he was still in the Nation of Islam, and there was some police brutality in New York City and Harlem, and a number of people from the Fruit of Islam, hundreds, surrounded the police station and did not do anything except just stood there in their black suits and their black ties and their pose, and they stayed there, and the police chief came out and talked to Malcolm, and he said, what do you want? He said, you let our brothers go. And they let him go, and then Malcolm nodded, and everybody went home. And it was an example, as opposed to, they didn't rely on the courts, they didn't rely upon physical